Welcome to the Climate Policy Initiative webinar on implementing alignment recommendations for the International Development Finance Club. This webinar will cover a research project mandated by the International Development Finance Club and the European Climate Foundation, which occurred in two parts. Part 1, led by I4CE, establishes a theoretical and conceptual basis for alignment. Part 2, led by CPI, identifies the changes the Paris Agreement implies for the role of development finance institutions. This webinar will be presented by Ian Cochran from the Institute for Climate Economics and Bella Tonkanogi and June Choi from CPI. The format will be a half-hour presentation followed by a question and answer session. All attendees will be on mute, but during this time, you are welcome to submit questions by typing them into the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll address them after the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be available online in the coming days. And now I will turn it over to Ian.
Thank you so much. I think I'm unmuted now. My name is Ian Cochran, and I am a Senior Advisor at I4CE Institute for Climate Economics, and I'm going to kick things off today with a short overview of the conceptual discussion paper that I4CE contributed to this project. All right, sorry, one second. Yes, so in thinking about what Paris alignment means for financial institutions, I4CE went back to the Paris Agreement and began to look at exactly what it calls for around the three objectives laid out in Article 2, as well as think about the implications of this for financial institutions. And we began by thinking about why financial institutions are increasingly committing to align their activities with the agreement. And in this process, we identified three principal reasons. Firstly, many, and particularly including the development finance institutions, will be called to directly contribute to the achievement of the long-term climate goals by shareholders. Secondly, almost all institutions will also be increasingly pushed to manage the risks and opportunities associated with the needed transformation of the economy and the financial environment. And finally, all financial institutions, as well as in general economic actors, will need to take into account and respond to the changing physical climate itself. In order to move from thinking of why financial institutions should be addressing this issue of Paris alignment, we developed a three-dimensional framework for thinking about what alignment will actually mean for institutions as they move from commitments and into rolling out new strategies and approaches. So this framework is based around three ideas. Firstly, a comprehensive scope of action, a long-term time horizon to guide impact, as well as a framework for thinking about what ambitious scale of contribution financial institutions will be making to the objectives of the agreement itself. And I'll now quickly go through each of these three different dimensions. Firstly, in terms of a comprehensive scope of action, we have put forward in our paper that financial institutions seeking to align their activities with their Paris Agreement will need to screen all of their activities for the direct or indirect contributions to low greenhouse gas climate resilient development. In terms of sectors and business areas, this will mean going beyond what often have been considered as the climate-related sectors, such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc., to look at all of their areas that they're involved with, from upstream oil and gas to different parts of the energy sector, down into other areas of activities such as real estate, agriculture, and forestry. Also, in terms of a comprehensive scope of action, institutions will need to go beyond just looking at direct impacts, but also think about how the projects they're involved with are part of larger systems and value chains to make sure that value chains that are incompatible with the long-term objectives of the agreement are not supported indirectly by their activities. And then this should hopefully occur both at the national and global levels. Secondly, in terms of a long-term time horizon, the framework that we've put forward would request and push financial institutions to make sure that they are keeping the long term in mind, and that in the end of the day, it's important to be supporting the transformation of countries themselves rather than ensuring just a minimal carbon footprint, etc., of their portfolios themselves. So as financial institutions develop their objectives and strategies, they should be looking at the contribution to, again, these long-term goals and attempting to ensure that there's no accidental lock-in or maladaptation, so they are prioritizing actions that are both consistent with reducing emissions and increasing resilience today, but ensuring that those are also in step with the long-term transformations that we need, so lock-in is not indirectly occurring. And this will require accepting and recognizing and starting to think about impacts in terms of both relative and absolute terms. So that while in some instances there may be a relative reduction in emissions or increase in resilience, we also, in the end of the day, need to look at the absolute emissions given the net zero long-term objective and the need to increase resilience across the entire economy and society. Finally, the third dimension of the framework proposes a way of thinking about the contribution that a financial institution will choose to make to the long-term objectives. In the framework, we posit that all financial institutions, and in general all economic actors, should be seeking to do no harm through their activities. And this idea of harm, of course, will be directly related to the national context and the transformation that the low-carbon, climate-resilient development will require in each country. After institutions are ensured that they're not doing any harm across their activities, it is then up to them in relationship to their different mandates and ability to accept different levels of risk and non-financial returns to think about whether their contribution will focus on supporting Paris-consistent climate co-benefits. So again, supporting climate outcomes that themselves are consistent with the long-term objectives of the agreement, in our framework we discuss quite a bit the specific role for development finance institutions in this area to foster transformative outcomes in terms of supporting the creation of new markets, the diffusion of the technologies that are needed, and having demonstration effects to help scale up climate-related investment in finance across the entire economy. So this framework, we hope, can help, and I'll be passing things over to my CPI colleagues in a moment, can help lay some ground rules for discussion and help to better frame exactly what we mean when talking about Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement and alignment with the Paris Agreement, and then in turn seeing how each institution can develop its own approach and strategy for aligning its objectives. So I'll leave things there. I'd be happy to respond to any questions later in the discussion and hand things over to my colleagues for CPI for the remainder of the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian, and thanks so much for that introduction to your conceptual, to I4CE's conceptual framework on alignment. And good morning and afternoon, everyone. This is Bella Tonkanogi from CPI, and thanks so much again for joining our webinar. So a CPI study picks up on the alignment framework that was developed by I4CE and presented by Ian. And we applied it to development finance institutions, specifically the International Development Finance Club, or IDFC. The IDFC is a diverse group comprising 24 development finance institutions, including national, regional, and bilateral development banks. And its assets under management total $4 trillion, and that compares, for example, to the multilateral development banks' assets under management, which total $1.5 trillion. And so for this study, we focused on identifying concrete steps that development finance institutions, and specifically the IDFC members, can take to implement alignment. For the study, we took as a starting point the IDFC's 2018 position paper on alignment, which outlines their commitment to alignment for all members. And then we we conducted in-depth survey of 8 of those 24 IDFC members. Their logos, the logos of those 8 institutions are at the bottom of the slide. We talked to most of these as well, and then conducted as well an extensive literature review, as well as further discussions with experts in the field. And throughout the study and the presentation, we've tried to sprinkle short case studies to highlight some of the current best practices, acknowledging that all institutions have plenty of room to grow towards alignment. And finally, what this study is not, just so you know, it's not a benchmarking exercise. So we didn't undertake to compare IDFC members to each other or to any sort of ideal that we've presented. What we've done is rather focus on understanding what it takes for every institution to get to alignment. And as such, this work is also applicable to other development finance institutions beyond the IDFC. So let me now hand over to my colleague June Choi, who will take you through the detailed recommendations of the study. Thanks.
Hello, can everyone hear me all right? All right, thank you, Bella. So the study identifies 3 areas of action that IDFC members can focus on as they implement alignment. First, let me get to this slide. These are purposefully not arranged in a hierarchy, but rather as 3 equal parts of a triangle, as they are mutually reinforcing, and each institution may be able to prioritize different areas depending on their context. Starting with the country level, the publicly mandated DFIs, their ability to implement alignment is greatly facilitated or constrained by their countries of operation through both board leadership and enabling environments. However, IDFC members are also uniquely positioned and trusted to support governments in contributing effectively to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So we propose in the study that institutions can take advantage of their close relationship with the governments in their countries of operation. The strategic level demonstrates that Paris alignment will require executive leadership to influence how decisions are made and the modalities to execute them. This extends to institutional objectives and targets, staff incentive structures, as well as institution-wide risk management frameworks. Finally, the operational level recognizes that the strength of alignment lies in each institution's day-to-day operations, from the metrics used for measuring progress to the way individual investment decisions are made. All investments across the institution's operations will need to be assessed against alignment criteria, and capital should be deployed using modalities that help deliver the transformative change necessitated by the Paris Agreement. One place that many members can start is what we have called the internal working definition of alignment, which is at the center of the triangle. This can act as a guiding post for an institution as it implements alignment across the 3 levels, while referencing the 3 dimensions for alignment that Ian has just presented. The goal of the working definition is to create a description understood by the institution's staff and external stakeholders of how the institution understands alignment in its own context. It should answer the questions, what is an aligned investment, and what will it mean for our institution to be aligned? This table shows how the working definition references the 3 dimensions of alignment that Ian presented. In the next slide, I will show some examples of emerging approaches that IDFC members have already adopted. For instance, developing a working definition based on an article-by-article analysis of the Paris Agreement, referencing 100% Paris compatibility as a target for all its operations, and identifying different working definitions through an internal task force to evaluate which definition is most suitable for its context. Over the next few slides, I'll be summarizing recommendations within each level while highlighting some promising examples that are already being implemented by the IDFC members. At the country level, IDFC members are well positioned to support governments in building capacity and developing forward-looking policy analysis and reform, contributing in turn to devising low-emissions, climate-resilient development pathways. For instance, AFD's Adaptation Facility provides technical support for translating NDCs into long-term sectoral policies focused on the most vulnerable sectors across 15 countries. The facility also helps conduct vulnerability assessments where there are none currently available. Institutions may also focus on building in-country capacity to identify and mitigate climate risks, including physical, liability, and transition risks. For instance, a report authored by CPI's energy finance team looks at long-term climate risk in South Africa at the level of the whole economy, as well as its impact on cities and sectors, especially the financial sector. The report looks at how a least cost transition approach would work, how to manage transition risk appropriately, and how to support a just transition. The study also recommends explicit allocation of climate risk and that a clear understanding of stakeholders' responsibilities is needed to manage the interplay between climate commitments and vulnerable sectors of the economy. The third and fourth recommendations for the country level are coordination of multiple ministries, as well as the private sector and civil society, and working proactively with government stakeholders who have oversight over member institutions, to understand and prioritize alignment alongside development priorities within the institution's mandate. For instance, CABE's Board of Governors recently issued a carbon zero statement referencing sector-specific low-carbon resilient pathways and the Paris Agreement. CABE has also made commitments to enhance transparency and accountability for green project outcomes, which may include those financed through intermediary lending. Next, we will move on to the strategic level, where we first recommend that members adopt institution-wide objectives which encapsulate both a long-term vision as well as near-term milestones, and accompanied by appropriate metrics. As an example, DBSA has introduced a target for private capital mobilization. It is one of the only institutions globally in which key performance indicators for catalyzing finance are featured in the corporate scorecard. The DBSA also has targets for crowding in third-party finance, as well as a formal working group that's tasked with developing and implementing a mobilization measurement methodology. In the next slide, I will explain in detail the type of objectives and criteria appropriate for alignment. So this diagram represents a hypothetical DFI's entire portfolio. So on the left-hand side, you see it demonstrates the Paris-aligned portion of the portfolio, where I4CE's framework, particularly their scale of contribution dimension, may be directly utilized to help institutions set appropriate objectives for alignment. In addition, alignment requires institutions to consider how they may contribute to long-term and transformative change, as you can see at the dark red target at the center. Going beyond mainstreaming also requires a full phase-out of non-aligned projects by setting a firm deadline for stopping non-aligned activities, as you see on the right-hand side of the diagram. To guarantee that meaningful progress is made to meet these objectives, however, the institution must also review the criteria and metrics it's using to measure its progress. For instance, current volume-based or percentage-based climate finance targets are likely to fall short, as the criteria does not necessarily imply that all projects are Paris consistent in the long run or necessarily differentiate between greater or lesser transformative impact. Several institutions have also proposed methods for tracking transformative change, and you can find a summary of those in our report. The second key step at the strategic level is building capacity and generating buy-in among staff to support implementation across all operations, including direct lending, intermediary lending, and procurement. Several members have cited to us that applying for Green Climate Fund accreditation was an important process for shedding light on skills and capacity gaps, and developing the capacity to measure and report on climate-relevant metrics, establishing best practices for climate projects, and finally serving as a starting point for knowledge exchange, especially for staff development and training. A further step is encouraging investments in aligned activities through increasing use of members' risk capacity towards transformative projects as well as to manage climate risks. As an example of the latter, AFD conducted an extensive physical risk exposure exercise, scoring each existing client in its loan portfolio against 5 major climate hazards and allocating attention flags to counterparties with scores above the 90th percentile of the portfolio in at least one climate hazard. This helps to identify not just projects at high risk, but also clients at high risk. This approach is beginning to affect their loan origination process, whereby countries are scored against the 5 major hazards. Crucially, the objective is not to simply avoid exposure to these risks, but to design financing solutions that are appropriate for the most exposed borrowers. So this can also help a lot with the project origination process. Finally, at the operational level, there are many different intervention points. For instance, new ways of designing projects, developing proofs of concept, developing definitions and methodologies as to how the concept of transformative can be applied to the institution and tracked. Learning can filter upward as well as downwards. So even without strong leadership, there are many points of intervention. This is something that we would like to stress in the report. First, we recommend that developing and integrating alignment assessment processes and decision-making criteria into investment decisions is an important part of the process. And this needs to happen across all operations, including direct lending, procurement, technical assistance, and policy lending as well. Several IDFC members, such as KfW, are making use of exclusion lists and other criteria, such as industry-specific emission standards, to exclude specific categories of non-aligned investment, such as coal power plants and unconventional oil and gas extraction. This has already led to the bank declining project investments due to non-alignment with the Paris Agreement, including several highly emissive or projects that have high lock-in effects. Second, at the operational level, it is important to support clients with the development of aligned projects and programs from the earliest stages to address the availability of bankable projects, one of the most critical barriers to aligned finance. Beyond the alignment of direct lending, for instance, AFD's SunRef initiative supports intermediary lending through local financial institutions with credit facilities and technical assistance and appropriate incentives. The success of the program has led to a replication at scale with Green Climate Fund support to transform local financial institutions' lending practices, including by engaging with them at the project origination phase. Next is increasing the use of modalities and structures such as risk mitigation instruments that are effective at mobilizing private capital. These are often underutilized in development finance institutions. An example of an institution working to overcome this barrier is DBSA, who has established a product innovation unit to design and implement innovative financial instruments. And one such product that has reached implementation is their climate finance facility, which has also been co-financed by the Green Climate Fund. Finally, evaluating and publicly reporting on progress made, as well as knowledge sharing, will allow institutions to improve over time. An example of a strong platform for this is the IDFC Climate Facility, established this year to institutionalize collaborative work and cross-capitalization among development banks. Initiatives such as this take advantage of the instrumental role that DFIs can play in spurring climate action in their constituencies. So this finalizes the summary of our report. I would like to hand over back to Bella for close.
Great, thanks so much, June. So the next two slides, the final two slides, cover next steps for IDFC members and also potentially other development financial institutions. So first, we just want to say that collaboration and lesson sharing with other development finance institutions, including amongst the IDFC members, will most certainly be needed in particular, to harmonize approaches and reduce duplication to the extent possible, including on definitions of alignment terms and adoption of some of the frameworks that we've presented here. Metrics for measuring progress, methodologies, in particular those for assessing and analyzing potential investments in terms of their alignment with the Paris Agreement, and finally on some of the more intensive modeling that's likely to be required both by the development finance institutions themselves as well as the governments that they work with on policy reform. The second point on this slide is that IDFC members, in particular many of the national and regional members, will need support, in both political as well as financial, from the international community and shareholder governments in order to be able to reach their potential to drive investment towards a Paris-aligned future. So finally, just want to close by saying that through this effort, we've spoken with a diversity of development finance institutions and many in the research community to understand what is needed to reach alignment. And what we've understood is that the transition to alignment for development finance institutions, both individually as well as collectively, will not be easy and it will take time. And therefore, we emphasize, and many have emphasized to us, that there's really no time to lose and that it should start now. And so the follow-up question that we've gotten to that statement a lot is, well, many institutions have asked us, what do we prioritize? Where should we start? And a couple ways that we answer that question. First, while development finance institutions share a common goal, implementation will be heavily context dependent, as institutions are quite different in their operations and the countries they work in. However, there are good starting points for any institution regardless of its context. So first, for those institutions with centralized leadership, they can already start from more of the strategic level. So conducting a review of their mandate and mission statements, setting ambitious objectives that reach the whole of the institution and its operations, etc., in order to drive change internally. For institutions that may have, say, champions within the institution at the operational level, what we've seen is some institutions starting by developing proofs of concept. So, really looking to demonstrate how aligned investment can work within their organization. And also they can start to work at the technical level in collaboration with other institutions, for example, on criteria for transformative change or for what constitutes climate co-benefits. And what we've seen is that many institutions and many champions within the institutions have been able to leverage external resources, including from the Green Climate Fund, from the Global Environment Facility, as well as from other development finance institutions, such as the bilateral banks, to actually help them get started and drive some of this internal change. And so finally, just to close, eventually, of course, leadership at all levels will be needed. And for development finance institutions, especially that two-way relationship with government is truly critical to put them on the path towards alignment with the Paris Agreement. So thank you so much for your attention till now, and I will hand back over to Caroline to kick off the
Great. Thank you to our presenters, Ian, Bella, and June. We will now take a minute or two to collect questions. As a reminder, you can type your questions in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Had a few questions come in, so I think we can kick this off. We did have a quick question about the PowerPoint, and yes, that will be available on our website in the coming days. This has also been recorded, and we will send that out to you as well. I think first we're going to address a question on private banks and which were included for this study. Ian, do you want to address that?
Yes, excuse me for the lag. The program froze and I unmuted myself. So thank you for the question about private banks. So just perhaps to clarify, again, this study was in two parts. Part one, which I4C conducted, is an overall conceptual framework that can be valid for all financial institutions or, in general, economic actors and governments when thinking about their alignment strategy, whereas part two of the study conducted by CPI looks specifically at the development finance community. So it's just important to remember that the specific recommendations from my colleagues from CPI are framed for the mandated development finance institutions. However, if we do look at today where we see commitments on Paris alignment, it's important to note that these commitments are not just coming from the public sector. At the COP last year in Katowice, we had a group of major commercial banks, including ING and BNP and others, take a commitment to not only align with the Paris Agreement, but also actively contribute to achieving the objectives of the agreement. So it's not just managing the climate risks, which of course is part of the story, but it's also about seeing how to specifically contribute to the achievement of the long-term goals. And that in some ways dovetails with the commitments we've seen from the public development finance community dating back to 2017 and the joint commitment taken by the multilateral development banks and the IDFC members to align their activities with the Paris Agreement at the One Planet Summit. And then maybe just to close so we can move on to the other questions, what we did see at the end of September in the margins of the Global Climate Action Summit in New York is that the UNEP FI, the financial initiative, launched the Principles for Responsible Banking, where the first principle of responsible banking is alignment. And that alignment is not only with, of course, the broader SDGs, but with the Paris Agreement and the global climate objectives themselves. So we see this topic of alignment being not just a public issue, but something that's increasingly being taken up by the broader commercial and private financial community. And as well, there's work going on by the IIGC, so the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, with results being released early next year. So we definitely see movements from all sides on this issue.
Great, thank you, Ian. Our next question is about how one determines whether alignment is happening with the Paris Agreement or other standards like the IFC performance standards. June, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So currently, there is no standard template for assessing progress on alignment with the Paris Agreement. And as you will see in our report, because of the way that we have suggested that institutions take alignment, which is very context dependent, with some major intervention points suggested. Each institution will take a different approach, and the targets that they will set will also be suited to their own context. So there is no standard checklist that a third party may use at the moment to assess how an institution is doing on alignment progress. The IFC performance standards is something that's very highly taken into consideration when these institutions are developing various standards, and so there is definitely room that as the IFC also engages more in these conversations, alignment criteria and what that requires for institutions could be incorporated in various through other standards as the discussion continues. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, June. Our next question is whether attention is being paid to increase ambition to the NDCs. Bella, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And I think I can also at the same time speak to a related question about shouldn't DFIs be aligned with their own government targets for the Paris Agreement, and that seems like the best way to cascade up all efforts to the signatory level. So yes, so what the point we make in the report is that for development finance institutions, their relationship with the governments in their countries of operation is pretty much fundamental, and it's actually a two-way relationship, as both of these questions allude to. On the one hand, governments are setting goals or targets through their nationally determined contributions and through other sectoral policies. At the same time, those targets are often informed by the development finance institutions in those countries. In particular, the development finance institutions are often relied on for their expertise to help governments in developing analysis and modeling and plans in order to set those targets. And so there's an opportunity for many development finance institutions to really build the capacity of governments and to help them increase their ambition over time. And so we really thought of this relationship as a two-way relationship and really fundamental and a big differentiator of development finance institutions from the other commercial financial institutions. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We had a question from Fiona whether if we say stop funding fossil fuel projects in a country, will the institution put in green finance to ensure an equivalent development outcome? Ian, do you have any thoughts on that?
All right, I think, sorry, my microphone froze again. I think to jump in on that with a question from Fiona Ryan, the issue of, if we do seek to scale down funding for fossil fuels, which will be necessary in most country contexts in relatively rapidly, and this gets back to what Bella was saying around NDCs and in some ways as well the long-term strategies that will need to be put into place at the scale of each country to achieve their part of the long-term climate goals. We do need to see not only green finance, being scaled up to support equivalent development outcomes, but we also need to see these green projects or consistent projects themselves becoming economically viable and a pipeline of projects emerging that can in turn be invested in by the financial sector. And so part of that is going to be, of course, related to national governmental policy in terms of putting in place this investment environment that makes low carbon and resilient as economically competitive tomorrow as in some ways fossil fuels and perhaps non-resilient projects are today, if not more so. But again, that's that connection between the policy investment framework that will be put into place at the country level and then how different parts of the financial value chain, whether public development banks or commercial financial institutions, can play in supporting the development of the markets and the services associated with that low carbon resilient kind of alternatives. So it's not something that's going to be necessarily a single institution who has a role in doing that, but a coordinated effort across the policy and financial community.
Thanks. We're now going to turn to a question from David. In order for MDBs to change their ability to manage climate risk, does this often require changing their mandate and thus an intervention of financial ministries or treasuries that are often less familiar with the alignment agenda? Bella or June?
Yeah, sure. So I can start, and then I can hand over to June to speak to some of the discussions that she had with some of these institutions on this specific question. So I think what I can start by saying is that, yes. Well, first of all, we focus on the IDFC members, so not the multilateral development banks. So I can't speak specifically to multilateral development banks, but their governance is very similar to many of the IDFC members in that they have government shareholders, generally represented by their finance ministries or treasuries, that are approving and in some cases driving policy, certainly approving policy within the institutions that they oversee. There is very much, and kind of similar to this question, the previous question that I answered about NDCs in relationship with government, there is a role here for IDFC members as well to help, in particular from their level of executive leadership, to develop some of these approaches and propose them forward to their boards, and also to, in some cases, build capacity among their board members for understanding climate risk. So they don't necessarily only have to, say, accept what is being, say, passed down from their boards, but also can play a role in helping to build the board's capacity and understanding of why issues such as climate risk are so important to address in order to achieve the development outcomes that all government shareholders are seeking and are backing via these institutions. Let me see if June as well wants to add anything.
Yeah, sure. So it is very true that ministries and governments are often heavily involved in these IDFC institutions. And just to add to what Bella said, because often these governmental organizations are very involved in the IDFC's mandate at a high level, in some cases the procedure is very strict to actually change the wording of the mandate and requires a change in the law, for instance. And there are some institutions where changing like the wording of the mandate is actually a little bit less strict. But what's important, we think, for IDFC members to realize is that in often cases, the mandate is actually not so specifically worded to not allow alignment with the Paris Agreement. For instance, all of the mandates have a focus on promotion for domestic business and economic and development objectives. And that's not necessarily mutually exclusive to Paris Agreement, but based on how the board takes that mandate and implements it and interprets it, that can make a big change in how the institution can implement alignment.
Great, thank you. I'd just also like to highlight that Alice, who is part of the I4C team, shared a link about who among signatories of the UNEP Financial Institution Principles for Responsible Banking took a specific commitment on alignment in September. So thank you, Alice, for sharing that link. Next, we'd like to go to a question from Anastasia, who asked whether the financial institutions need to follow a common or aligned reporting and evaluation methodology when reporting on the portfolio shift results. Ian, maybe you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, I can jump in real quick, and now that I see, Anastasia, that you have corrected to say IDFC members, of course, Bella and June, please do jump in after me since you were looking at this more closely. I think in general what we can say is that while it might be too early to talk about a change in terms of common aligned reporting, although obviously we need to have some type of harmonization of concepts to ensure that we are calling apples apples and oranges oranges and all these good things, is to think about a shift perhaps away from a volume-focused approach to thinking about climate finance, because in the end we're asking for the entire portfolio to be consistent. So it's less of a volume question because 100% in theory, or we can make the case at some point needs to be consistent, is really starting to think about what the impact of that volume is. And so we are already seeing a trend in terms of a focus increasingly on outcome-orientated reporting. So again, in New York, the MDBs, in discussion with a number of the IDFC members, have launched a consultation on resiliency and adaptation-focused impact reporting around different types of financial activities. And so again, I think Paris alignment makes us go beyond, in some cases, just thinking about whether or not there is some form or some rationale to classify a transaction as climate beneficial, to really start thinking about how are transactions really supporting the long-term, the achievement of the long-term objectives, and particularly for the development finance institutions seeking to have a transformational outcome of going beyond just the incremental one more windmill or one more solar panel, where these are mature markets in most cases, to thinking about how is the finance being used to create the new markets and really scale up the change and the transformation that needs to be seen over the next decade. Bella or June, I don't know if you might have anything to add in specifically around IDFC members today.
Right. So thanks, Ian. I can add just a little bit of context. So it's true at the moment IDFC members do not currently have a target for transformative outcome, for example. And in some cases, it'll be for example, they will say they promote transformative outcome-oriented projects. However, not all institutions have a common understanding of what it would take for a project to be transformative in addition to being climate beneficial. And so this represents why this kind of work that's presented in a report on alignment is sort of pushing the boundaries of what it means to go beyond climate mainstreaming. So it's asking institutions to revisit the criteria metrics they're using when they say their climate finance target is this, and they've contributed this year like 50% of the portfolio to climate finance. But what they really need to do is look back at the science-based targets, and also to make sure that they're not only focused on short-term targets, but also that they're going into the more difficult, potentially more cost-intensive projects that allow them to do a long-term transition. So these are all emerging definitions, and as these institutions are knowledge sharing about which metrics are appropriate and which are not, it'll become easier for us as third parties to really evaluate amongst how institutions are performing.
Great, thank you. Because of time, we'll take just one final question, which is, in this slowdown time, what are the strategies to be adopted for green investment, as the industries are reluctant for investment for GHG reduction? Bella, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really good question, and I think it points to one of the messages that we tried to highlight in the report, in particular on the modalities that DFIs, development finance institutions, should be using, and what their role is in the economy. And I think much research has pointed to that DFIs are often not taking enough risk, and in particular, their role in many economies should be to step up and take some risk in order to help drive new types of investment that face certain barriers that mean that private investors may not be investing at optimal levels for. And so that could include, barriers could include, for example, a technology that has never been deployed before in that country, or a risk of performance risk, or certain types of payment or demand risk. There's many risks that we've kind of discussed in other papers as well, and other CPI research, including things like project preparation risk or pre-development risk that green investments can face. And so the role of DFIs, and what we talk about in the report, is that they can be using additional tools for risk mitigation, things like guarantees or others that help to drive that private investment. And so and we consider this to be part of alignment, because without DFIs playing that role, getting to those longer term transformative outcomes will be more difficult in any country. So thanks for that question.
Great, thank you. This concludes our webinar. Thanks again to our presenters, and thank you for your attention. If we weren't able to get to your question today, please feel free to reach out to me through the email address that I'll soon post into the chat box. To learn more about what was discussed, please download the full report on the CPI website. We, along with I4CE, will be hosting a workshop on the findings and recommendations from this work at COP25 in Chile. If you're interested in attending, please reach out to me directly via email. I'd also like to draw your attention to a webinar that we'll be hosting on November 7th and 8th that will highlight key findings from our 2019 Global Landscape of Climate Finance report. I will now post all of these links in the chat box. Thank you and have a great day.